Perhaps the most pressing question, prescriptive question, that's posed by free will concerns punishment. If people don't have the kind of free will that we thought they did, if they're not morally responsible, then what does that mean for the ethics of punishment? Can we justify punishment morally if people don't have free will? Or does morality demand that we give up on the practice of punishment if people don't have free will? This question is, of course, especially salient for the free will skeptic, because the skeptic is the one who denies that free will exists and denies that people are morally responsible. And we find the issue of punishment discussed already by d'Holbach, who was our representative skeptic from the 18th century. So d'Holbach considers this objection. People had said to him, even in his time, well, if you don't believe in free will, then how are you going to justify the practices of punishing criminals? And one of d'Holbach's responses to the problem of punishment was to say that, well, just as a person who commits a bad action does so because he was determined, so too we punish him because we're determined. He was determined by the forces of nature to be bad. We are similarly determined to punish him by the forces of nature. Now, this is obviously a really glib reply. Crucially, it does nothing to defend the moral appropriateness of the action. Because just saying, I'm determined to punish the guy doesn't say anything in defense of the idea that it was morally appropriate for me to punish the guy. d'Holbach has more to say. Like later theorists, d'Holbach defends punishment by appealing to the good consequences. For one thing, punishment serves to discourage people from socially detrimental behavior like stealing and killing. And in addition, punishment can help shape people. It can determine people to have good moral characters. So d'Holbach suggests in his early discussions of this that we can use punishment to build people to have good moral characters. So we take advantage of the deterministic processes to shape them into being good people. In this lecture, we'll consider how the ethics of punishment stacks up against the problem of free will. We'll look at various approaches to punishment in something like a chronological order, starting from the early practices of vengeance. And for each approach to punishment, we will explore whether it depends on the idea of free will and also whether the approach is generally morally acceptable. So this will really be focused on the ethics of punishment. For each theory, we'll see that philosophers have some reservations about whether the theory of punishment is morally acceptable. So philosophers have raised moral qualms about every proposed theory of punishment. The way we think of punishment now, at least in the U.S., is largely in terms of what people deserve. That people should be punished based on what they deserve. But it's not so clearly like this in the early emergence of the law. The early emergence of the law seems linked to the idea of vengeance. And vengeance is often regarded as the earliest version, the earliest form of punishment. And it's also at the heart of blood feuds, which have and continue to play a large role in small-scale societies. One important feature of blood feuds is that it can be appropriate to harm someone who didn't himself produce the bad outcome. So the individual who is harmed, who is the subject of the attack, doesn't have to be the wrongdoer. So it's perfectly appropriate in a blood feud to try to harm the brother of the offender. For instance, if you can't get to the offender himself, then it's certainly acceptable to attack his kin if you're engaged in a blood feud. Relatedly, the notion of proportional punishment is not so central to vengeance. Rather, the aim is often to do great damage to the enemy. In a blood feud, that's what you want, apparently. You want to try to invoke as much chaos as you can on the enemy. You don't try to carefully balance off how much wrong he did to you and then try to exact precisely that much harm. No, you're trying to retaliate, and that will often mean doing more damage to him than he did to you. Another important feature of vengeance is that it can be appropriate to seek vengeance even when the outcome wasn't intended by the person at all. So if Jones's ox tramples and kills Smith's child, Smith might go out and seek vengeance against Jones even though Jones intended no harm. This would not be out of bounds of the norms of vengeance. We find something similar to vengeance in early legal codes, that the idea of vengeance seems to be part of what shapes early legal codes. In early English law, a person was held responsible if his sword fell on someone and injured them. So there it looks like there's no intention to harm there. It was an accident, but the person is still held responsible. In effect, these laws held people strictly liable. That is, for certain bad outcomes, the person is held responsible even if the outcome was neither intentional nor obviously negligent. Even today, we have some laws that operate under strict liability. In some states, store clerks are strictly liable for selling alcohol to minors. So if they sell alcohol to minors, it doesn't matter if they did their best to try to avoid it, they're still held responsible. One of the really important things about vengeance for our purposes is that it doesn't depend on the idea of free will and responsibility. If I think I should seek vengeance against a neighbor or his family, it doesn't matter if I find out that there's no such thing as free will. What matters is striking back at the offender. Airy reflections about determinism are quite irrelevant. And this is made especially vivid by the fact that it can be appropriate to attack the wrongdoer's kin, and it can be appropriate to seek vengeance for offenses that weren't even intentional. What matters is striking back, retaliating against the offense, basically. So the offender is going to get paid back. Since vengeance doesn't require free will, that means that even if we don't have free will, that won't undercut the propriety of vengeance. So the free will skeptic would be free to embrace vengeance. Vengeance and blood feuds seem to be immune from worries about free will. But this is not really all that much comfort for the free will skeptic, because few educated people today are in favor of endorsing or returning to vengeance and the blood feud. To our modern sensibilities, vengeance and blood feuds just seem barbaric. So while we have identified a form of punishment that doesn't depend on free will, it's not a form that's regarded as morally viable. In place of vengeance and blood feud, the next major approach to punishment that emerges historically is the idea of retribution. And retribution continues to be central to common sense views about punishment. Again, at least in the US, but actually probably pretty broadly, retribution is a very common view of punishment. And the notion of retribution is at the heart of the doctrine lex talionis, an eye for an eye. Talionis, the term talionis is not related to the word for the part of an eagle claw. It's not a talon. That's what I used to think. But the word talionis shares a root with the word retaliate. But the relevant notion of retribution here is more refined, or the relevant notion of retaliation here is more refined than the crude notion of vengeance. So retaliation is part of vengeance, but the way it plays out in retribution is more sophisticated in a number of ways. The critical thing is that the idea of retribution is tied to the idea that people who do wrong deserve to be punished. And there are three different features here that I want to bring out. One is called positive retributivism, and that's the idea that the guilty deserve to be punished. That is, it's morally appropriate to punish the guilty. We should punish the guilty. It's a good thing to punish guilty people. That's positive retributivism. A second part of retributivism is negative retributivism, and that holds that only the guilty deserve to be punished. It's not morally appropriate to punish those who aren't guilty. The innocent should just be left alone. And then the third part of retributivism is proportionality, and that holds that the punishment should fit the crime. So it's wrong, for instance, to punish someone severely for a minor crime. You don't kill people for littering. Similarly, it's wrong to punish someone lightly for a severe crime. You'd think maybe someone who believes in retributivism would think it was preposterous to sentence a first-degree murderer to a weekend of community service. Somehow or other, the punishment should be appropriate to the crime. Now, of course, this picture of retributivism differs significantly from what we found in vengeance. In vengeance, you don't worry about desert. You worry about retaliation and beating down the wrongdoer and his kin. You don't distinguish the guilty from the innocent, and you don't sweat issues of proportionality. All of those elements, guilt, innocence, and proportion, are absolutely central to retributive approaches to punishment, though. Moreover, unlike punishment as vengeance, retributive approaches to punishment do seem to assume that we have free will. That is, the moral propriety of retribution seems to depend on the view that the wrongdoer possesses free will. So under retribution, we think that a person deserves to be punished if he's done wrong. Indeed, we even see this in the modern military. One American brigade in Iraq had the motto, "Punish the deserving." The idea of desert also grounds the retributivist view that only the wrongdoer deserves to be punished. His kin aren't responsible for his actions. So his brother doesn't deserve to be harmed. Only the wrongdoer himself deserves the punishment. The idea that a wrongdoer deserves to be punished seems to presuppose that the person freely chose their action. Why is punishing them morally appropriate? Because they chose to do the bad thing. And so they freely brought the punishment onto themselves. That's key to the idea of retribution. Although most people regard retributivism as a vast improvement on blood feuds, many are also uncomfortable with the idea of retributivism. One objection is that it's still barbaric and even grotesque. In civilized society, do we think it's morally right literally to take an eye for an eye? Now, some people maybe would accept this grotesque implication, but there's an obvious response. The standard retributivist move here is to say, well, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as what the wrongdoer did. You don't have to pop out an eyeball of somebody who killed or took somebody else's eyeball out. Rather, the point is to do something that's proportional to the crime. So if Bill pokes out John's eye, we don't pull out Bill's eye, but we have to inflict an appropriately severe punishment on Bill for such a serious offense. That's the idea of proportionality that the retributivist wants to retain. A deeper objection to retributivism is that it seems to advocate pointless suffering. If the suffering that you inflict on the wrongdoer won't produce any good, it seems needlessly cruel. This is one persistent objection to retributivism. The retributivist, by his own lights, says that he's not meting out punishment with any concern for future goods. He's not trying to create positive goods for something down the line. He's just punishing the deserving. He's just making the bad guy pay for what he did. Another standard objection to retributivism, and the one that's especially relevant for us, is that retributivism is inhumane because it depends on the false assumption that we have free will. And that gets us back to our central issue. If people don't have free will, then the fact that someone is a criminal is just bad luck, and it's morally wrong to punish them for bad luck. One way to make the point is to compare criminals with the physically ill. The criminal is no more responsible for his criminal behavior than the diabetic is for his poor circulation. So the argument goes, it's indefensible to take a retributive attitude, one that says this guy should be punished, towards the criminal. It's indefensible that we should punish the criminal because he deserves it, but we should nurture and tend to the diabetic. The idea that the diabetic doesn't deserve punishment, but the equally determined criminal does, that, the objection goes, makes no sense. Being diabetic is a product of nature, being a criminal is a product of nature, and so you shouldn't treat them any differently when it comes to punishment. This point is illustrated in Samuel Butler's 19th century satirical novel, Erewhon. In that fictional world, those who commit crimes are treated with compassion, while the physically ill are given long prison sentences and put to hard labor, punished and shamed. At one point in the novel, we get to hear a trial of a person who has pulmonary consumption, and the judge berates the defendant, saying, quote, "Yours is no case for compassion. This is not your first offense. You have led a career of crime. You were convicted of aggravated bronchitis last year." So again, the idea is in this world, they punish people, they blame people for being sick. And the judge goes on to preemptively dismiss any excuse as he says, quote, "It is all very well for you to say that you came of unhealthy parents and had a severe accident in your childhood which permanently undermined your constitution. Excuses such as these are the ordinary refuge of the criminal, but they cannot for one moment be listened to by the ear of justice. There is no question of how you came to be wicked, but only this, namely, are you wicked or not? This has been decided in the affirmative. You are a bad and dangerous person." This, that he's a bad and dangerous person, the judge says, is indicated by the fact that the defendant had committed one of the most heinous known offenses, namely pulmonary consumption. And this kind of example is used to illustrate how ridiculous it would be to treat the physically ill in a retributive way. The point here is not just that punishment isn't going to make them better. Making someone with pulmonary consumption engage in hard labor isn't going to do anything to cure their pulmonary consumption. The point is that, in addition, punishing the physically ill is morally inappropriate. When we see the society in Erewhon that punishes the sick, it brings home to us the fact that it's just not their fault. It seems so out of touch, so unfair to punish someone for pulmonary consumption. But at this point, the free will skeptic seems pressed into a corner. Just as it isn't the fault of the consumptive that he has consumption, neither is it the fault of the murderer that he's a murderer. He, just like the consumptive, is a product of nature. So if it's morally absurd to seek retribution against the consumptive, it's supposed to be equally absurd to seek retribution against the murderer. Let's turn then to alternative approaches to punishment that are available to somebody who rejects free will. Alternatives that don't depend on the idea of free will and don't depend on the idea of retribution. To see the distinction, or to see the alternatives, we should recognize a really central distinction in punishment theory generally. Philosophers draw this central distinction between two kinds of theories of punishment. One kind is called forward-looking, and the other is backward-looking. Backward-looking doesn't mean backward, at least it doesn't have to mean backward in any sort of pejorative sense. What it means is that the decision about whether punishment is morally appropriate depends largely or entirely on what happened in the past. By contrast, on forward-looking accounts, the decision about whether punishment is morally appropriate depends on the future effects of punishing someone. So backward-looking accounts say, when you're trying to decide whether to punish someone, you look backwards and see what happened. Forward-looking accounts say, if you're trying to decide whether to punish someone, you look forward to see what you'll get out of it. So both vengeance and retribution are backward-looking approaches to punishment. What makes a certain form of punishment on those views appropriate depends on who did what. It depends on what happened in the past. So, according to retributivism, for instance, the question, should McGillicuddy be punished, is answered by figuring out whether McGillicuddy is guilty of some bad action in the past. The answer to that question doesn't depend at all on what will happen in the future. That is, if you want to know whether or not McGillicuddy deserves to be punished, you don't look to the future, you see whether McGillicuddy did something bad in the past. So, as you might have anticipated, forward-looking approaches are the opposite. They say if you want to figure out whether this guy should be punished, you see, well, what's going to happen in the future? Now, the question, should McGillicuddy be punished, is answered on forward-looking accounts by considering the good and bad effects that punishing McGillicuddy will have now and in the future. All that matters is figuring out what we can do now that will have the best effects. What happened in the past on this account is morally irrelevant. The only reason the past is relevant to punishment at all on forward-looking accounts is because it can help us make predictions. So if we know that McGillicuddy has repeatedly done bad things, one after another, then this knowledge about the past can inform our decision about whether and how to punish McGillicuddy, because it allows us to figure out what things he's likely to do in the future and what things we can do to make the future better or as good as it can be. Many philosophers think that the only way to justify punishment is by giving a forward-looking account. You say, what's done is done. We can't change the bad thing that happened in the past. The best we can do now is figure out what we can do to make the future as best we can, as good as we can. Try to make the future the best future it can be. The contrast between these two different approaches, forward-looking and backward-looking, is perhaps the most central distinction in the ethics of punishment. Backward-looking theorists maintain that it just doesn't matter what punishment will do for the future. A wrongdoer deserves to be punished, and it's a good thing if he's punished. End of story. A retributivist might think that it's just a confusion to look for future gains when you're trying to decide on a punishment. The person who did wrong needs to pay, and that's all there is to it. One way to play up the full strength of the idea of the backward-looking nature of retributivism. Again, the backward look, not backward in the pejorative sense, but just that you look back to see whether or not it's an appropriate thing to do, goes as follows. So imagine that society is completely wiped out except for two people, a healthy murderer and a deathly ill judge. The judge is about to die, but he has it in his power to mete out a punishment to the murderer before the judge expires. The retributivist says it would be a morally good thing if the judge manages to enact the punishment before he dies, even though it won't improve society at all. There's not going to be any more society. It won't produce any future benefits to punish the murderer. But retributivism says, nonetheless, it would be a good thing if the judge does it. By contrast, forward-looking theorists just find this baffling. Why on earth should he punish the murderer? The whole show is over. Nothing good can come of punishing the murderer. So what matters is not what happened in the past on these theorists, according to these theorists, but only what we can do for the future. The most famous forward-looking approach to punishment is a theory that we've seen from time to time, utilitarianism. Utilitarian accounts of punishment reject the idea that anybody deserves punishment. Punishment, like everything else for the utilitarian, is right only insofar as it produces good consequences, and wrong only insofar as it produces bad consequences. Everything is right or wrong depending on whether it produces good or bad consequences for the people who are involved. Punishment will be no exception here. Punishment will fall exactly in line with the rest of the utilitarian approach to ethics. Now, utilitarians typically justify punishment by claiming that it will deter future crime. That's the positive good that comes out of punishment. So when we try to decide whether to punish someone, we merely look at the cost-benefit ratio. If punishing them will lead to better outcomes than not punishing, then we should punish. The morally right thing to do is to punish. So this is obviously a forward-looking account. What we look for, what we want to get in the future, is whatever future benefits we can. As elsewhere, utilitarianism just says, do whatever it takes to make things the best they can possibly be. As we saw in our discussion of utilitarianism in Lecture 17, utilitarianism has this distinct advantage that it has no debt to free will. It doesn't require that we have free will. Utilitarians don't care. For the ethics, it just doesn't matter whether we have free will, because all that matters are doing what it takes to get the best outcomes. So this approach to punishment gets out of the problem of worrying about whether we have free will. And it also avoids what some people think is the barbaric nature of retributivism. So you don't have this sort of backward-looking view that says we should still punish the murderer even if no good will come of it. But utilitarian approaches to punishment have their own shortcomings, and the problems are typical. As elsewhere in utilitarianism, as we've seen, their approach in general has extremely bizarre, counterintuitive consequences about what counts as moral. And their theory of punishment is exactly the same, that utilitarianism will recommend punishment in cases that we find really disturbing. So if all that matters is getting good effects in the future, then guilt and innocence are not in themselves morally significant at all. Utilitarians say punishment should be based entirely on what the consequences will be for the future. So the idea of punishing the guilty turns out to be, at best, kind of a useful strategy, but there's no moral reason for punishing the guilty. Even worse, there can be a moral reason for punishing the innocent, because all we do when we try to determine whether we should punish someone is we assess whether punishing them will have a good effect. If someone commits a serious crime, but we know that punishing them won't have any good consequences, then we shouldn't punish. On the other hand, if someone is innocent, but we know that punishing her will have really good consequences, then utilitarianism says the right thing to do is punish her. Again, this seems even worse when we realize that it's not just that the utilitarian says that it's okay to punish an innocent person. The utilitarian says if we don't punish the innocent person when doing so would create the most good, our action is morally wrong. That if it would create the most good to punish them, then the morally correct action is to punish them. So for any action that leads to overall worse consequences, doing that action is morally wrong. So again, if we discover that punishing a guilty person would produce less overall good, it's immoral to punish him. And if we discover that failing to punish an innocent person will lead to worse consequences, then it's immoral to fail to punish the person. There's a related problem about proportionality. If we know that wildly disproportionate punishments will have really good effects, then we should do that. But even if the consequences would be outstanding, it seems just clearly wrong to execute someone for shoplifting. What we find here is that utilitarianism is at odds with our retributive impulses. We naturally think that only the guilty deserve to be punished, that people shouldn't be punished out of all proportion, and that there's something good and appropriate about punishing the guilty. All of that, though, gets swept aside and thrown in the garbage by the utilitarian machine. There are other forward-looking alternatives to punishment besides utilitarianism, and I want to talk about two to close out this lecture. The best-known alternative is the rehabilitation account. On this view, criminals are sick and need to be fixed. They need to be cured, rehabilitated. Punishment for its own sake is cruel and unjustified. That what really we need are to treat criminals as if they have medical problems. And to make this a little bit plausible, think about some particularly horrible case like Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed and ate parts of his victims. Clearly there was something deeply wrong with that guy. His crimes revealed a deep and weird pathology. It's very natural to think of Dahmer as sick in the literal sense of needing some kind of medical treatment. There was something defective about that individual. Unlike utilitarianism, rehabilitation theory doesn't promote punishing the innocent or exercising disproportionate punishment. They're not trying to say, let's try to get the best social good we can. Rehabilitation theory is more narrowly focused in that. It's not aimed at using punishment however we can to make things better. It's focused on treating the criminal as having an illness, in need of care. But as with utilitarianism, a rehabilitation approach to punishment doesn't depend on the idea that people have free will. So far then, rehabilitation seems like a promising option. So it doesn't depend on free will, and it seems like it doesn't have some of the problems of utilitarianism. Although rehabilitation has advantages here, some worry about whether it's ethically legitimate to rehabilitate someone who doesn't want to be rehabilitated. This kind of issue gets made salient in A Clockwork Orange in a way because that case shows us in the book and the movie a criminal and the dehumanizing process of rehabilitation. Although in the book and the movie, actually, Alex wanted to be rehabilitated because he thought it would get him out of the prison sentence, but the consequences of it seemed like they were really pretty terrible and dehumanizing. Another alternative that also pursues a medical analogy is what people now call a quarantine account of punishment. So you can say, just as we're morally justified in quarantining people who have dangerous viruses, so we're morally justified in quarantining people that we anticipate will pose a danger to society. This doesn't require that we try to rehabilitate those who resist such rehabilitation, but the quarantine account does have the virtues of the rehabilitation account. So one of these virtues is it doesn't depend on the assumption about free will. We don't need to blame people for their misbehavior in order to quarantine them, any more than we blame them for having the Ebola virus, that we quarantine them even though we might think it's not their fault at all that they have this condition, that they have this contagious disease, or that they have this particular propensity to be violent. Also, just as we would do the minimum necessary to quarantine a person with a virus, so too we would only do the minimum necessary confinement for a person who exhibits dangerous behavioral tendencies. So this kind of view seems more humanitarian than either the retributivist view or the utilitarian view, which would say, oh, it's appropriate to punish people out of all proportion if that would produce the most good. So the quarantine model says, no, you just quarantine them as much as you need to get the appropriate social benefits of keeping them out of society and helping and sort of preserving us from their dangerous actions. One problem with quarantine accounts is that it does seem to allow certain people to get off the hook. So if someone commits a crime, say spousal murder, and we know that the circumstances were so exceptional that the individual will never again pose a risk in the future, then we have no basis for punishing them. That is, we don't have a quarantine-based justification for punishing them. We wouldn't quarantine a person who had a serious virus that then disappeared, that they didn't have the virus anymore. So if this person who committed a murder was then no longer likely to commit another murder, then we would have no justification in terms of quarantine to keep them out of society. More broadly, the quarantine and rehabilitation theories, like the utilitarian theory, are really counterintuitive. They run against our ordinary moral views in a number of ways. On all of these accounts, we have to give up the idea that the guilty in fact deserve to be punished. That's at the core of the retributivist view that many of us find really intuitive. We also have to give up the idea that worse crimes require more severe punishment. Really, worse crimes, just all we do to evaluate them is figure out either what will produce the best outcomes if you're a utilitarian, figure out how to fix the individual if you think rehabilitation is the right view, or figure out how long to keep them incarcerated, basically, to reduce the threat. On all of these accounts, the only thing that you look at are the future considerations, not the guilt of the person, not the severity of the crime. So these theories demand that we sacrifice our intuitions that the guilty deserve to be punished and that they deserve proportionately severe punishment. Of course, the fact that the forward-looking theories are counterintuitive doesn't mean that the theories are wrong. Indeed, the free will skeptic might press that the entire idea of retributivism, the only reason that seems intuitive to us, they could say, is because of our false belief in free will. Once we get rid of that false belief that we have free will, we'll have to look elsewhere for a theory of punishment anyway, and so we'll have to be willing to accept some of the counterintuitive consequences that seem to be pushed on us by the alternative theories.